Hola!
I'm Johanna.
And I'm Denisse.
Welcome and bienvenidos to the Love and Evolve podcast, where we discuss topics surrounding holistic wellness such as mental, physical, and spiritual health. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer.
Love and Evolve Wellness Podcast is a community space for conversation, growth, and healing. However, it is not a substitute for professional mental or medical care. El podcast no sustituye ayuda psicológica o médica.
We encourage you to seek resources and support in your community. We love you, los queremos mucho, and you matter to us.
Thank you for listening, and on to the show.
Hello, and welcome. We are so happy to be here.
Yes, hello, and welcome to episode 2, part 2 of our 3-part series on trauma. Our last episode, so the first of this series, was about our needs, assessing our needs, giving ourselves compassion, meeting ourselves where we are, and as well as diving into talking about self-care, as that's very, very important in exploring this type of work that is quite hard, right? Trauma is a difficult subject. So this episode that we're going to jump in today is defining a little bit more what trauma is all about.
Yes. And so what I wanted to do as we go into this work is to share a passage from an amazing book. This book is called Body Keeps the Score, and I definitely recommend it. I think that it does a really wonderful job at summarizing what trauma is, how it might look for some people physically, and really understanding the neuroscience behind trauma and how that really has an imprint, not just in our programming of our brains and how we function in the day-to-day, but also how it can have a big impact on our overall well-being. And so this passage is talking about the definition of trauma, and I'll go ahead and read it. We have learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It is also the imprint left by the experience on the mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. We have discovered that helping victims of trauma find the words to describe what has happened to them is profoundly meaningful, but usually it is not enough. The act of telling the story doesn't necessarily alter the automatic physical and hormonal responses of bodies that remain hypervigilant, prepared to be assaulted or violated at any time. For real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present. Our search to understand trauma has led us to think differently, not only about the structure of the mind, but also about the process by which it heals.
So that is from The Body Keeps the Score. Some of you may have heard about this book. It's actually quite often on Instagram. A lot of people will share that they've read this book. It is by Besos van der Kolk, MD. And if you have the book, Joanna was reading from page 21. That's just if this is of interest to you and you want to take a look at this book. There's a lot going on there in those 2 paragraphs. And trauma is still being understood. I mean, back to the Vietnam War, when this was referred to as shell shock, and then later given the name of PTSD. So we're all still very, very much trying to understand what this is and how our bodies respond. Trauma can be experienced either directly. It can be something that you witness happening, or it could even be something that you hear about, that you know about. So, whether this is you're in a car accident, or you witness the car accident, or a loved one has experienced that car accident, and here you are taking in their experience because they are so close to you and you love them, and you're really like empathically feeling that experience with them.
One of the things that I wanted to add to that is that the DSM provides us the following definition for trauma. Trauma is when a person has experienced, witnessed, or been confronted with an event that involves actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And I think what's important about this is that we often think as trauma as, oh, something bad happened or something was done to me, or it might usually be, oh, it was physical or sexual, but that's not necessarily the case. Like you were saying, Denise, it could be witness. It could be someone sharing a story of something that happened to them that you are listening to, that you are taking in. And it's just really important to keep in mind that trauma doesn't necessarily mean something that is done to you.
Yes. And before I jump in on that, just to also clarify, so Joe had mentioned something called the DSM, and that stands for Diagnostic Statistical Manual, and that's used by psychologists, psychiatrists. So it's like, just like physicians have their own book of diagnoses and things, so does psychology, and this is a diagnostic tool. So if there's a list of symptoms, then a psychiatrist or psychologist would then reference this book and say, oh, okay, this person is hitting this many symptoms. And so therefore it looks like they're experiencing this diagnosis, for those that aren't familiar with what that is. And it's a reference tool. It doesn't mean it's always right. It's constantly being updated, but that's the most current that we have. But then jumping back into this as trauma being either experienced directly or whether it's something you witness, there can be a lot of shame around whether or not your trauma is valid or is traumatic enough. It may be that there's this perception of trauma having to have been experienced directly for it to be traumatic, when that's not the case. We now know that you can witness it or hear about it to be impacted in a very strong way, and that your experience is valid. It counts. If you are having a strong emotional or physiological, so your body is having a strong reaction to an incident, whether you've directly experienced it or not, that is valid. And that's something that's been talked about more and more, because there can be a lot of stigma around the experience of trauma.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Denise, for bringing that here, because I think oftentimes what we might hear happen is that, well, what happened to you wasn't that bad, or you are strong now, you're because of it. Those things may be true. You're stronger because of what happened, but that doesn't dismiss your experience. Know that it is valid, and it is an opportunity for us to explore and do some healing work when and if we are ready to do that and we feel safe to do so. And then something I would add too is that oftentimes we think as trauma as like one event or something that happens, but it also expands to, it can be multiple traumas. It can be continuous trauma, something that happens when we're young, and continues to happen on the day-to-day, which is known as complex trauma. And we'll talk more about that in detail in our next episode. But I think what's important to know is that trauma is universal, and it is impacting us in so many different ways. It can be a historical account. It could be, all the stuff that's going on in our world right now, or what we're being exposed to on the news, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, discrimination. Like, there's just so many different pieces that fall in here. And please know that this is not an expansive definition in any way. Please take this with a grain of salt. We're trying to plant the seed for you and give you a starting point. And this is not comprehensive.
Yeah, and that everyone has their own experiences to, come back to that point about if you've had a moment of suffering, that it counts, right? This isn't a competition of my suffering is greater than your suffering, right? If it's impacted you in any way, it's valid, and that's your experience, and that this is universal. So actually, let me go into a few examples. Some examples that people can then experience trauma from would be physical or emotional abuse, accidents, medical traumas, so illnesses, or, having to go through a surgery or a diagnosis that is life-altering, grief, violence. That's a really broad topic there, but war, having to flee your home. So if you're a refugee, and then the complex trauma. So the things that happen on a daily basis, that we'll expand a little bit more on. These are all things that people are experiencing at one time or another.
Racism.
Yeah. So systemic, right? Definitely, for some, I know for me, it's like watching the news can be traumatic because, if you're certainly someone who takes on people's sorrow and their suffering, that can be quite overwhelming to then have to see that repeated over and over and over again. It doesn't mean that if you shut it off, you don't care. It's just, it's got to take care of yourself and know what your body needs. For your body to feel shaken up about something, that's normal. It's normal to have a response, or even a lack of response is a response itself. Feeling shock or denial. And where the issues then can arise is when the emotional response has lingered, has overstayed its welcome, if you will, where it went from being a survival response to now it's leaving lasting long-term effects because you are distressed day in and day out. And now you're feeling sick, your stress has increased, anxiety, you're feeling shame, or you've got flashbacks. So that's when you start to go into things like PTSD.
Yeah, and some ways that you might know that you might be experiencing PTSD, you might be having intrusion symptoms. So that might look like recollections or playbacks or flashbacks, maybe nightmares, trouble with sleep, lack of sleep. You might also find yourself avoiding thinking about certain things or avoiding certain thoughts or memories, avoiding people, places, situations, certain conversations. And I think one of the things to remember is that the more we try to avoid, the more that it exacerbates the symptoms. And I mean, if this is what we have to do to survive in the moment, then that's okay. But it's also a sign that we might need more support. You might also see shifts in mood, like anger, fearful, depression, guilt, shame, or it might even be complete numbness, not really feeling anything at all, feeling detached from people, and hypervigilance too. So might feel on edge, might feel very irritable or have outbursts of emotions, might be anger outbursts or things like that.
Yeah. So as you can probably already tell, there is a vast way to experience this. And there are many ways that someone can experience trauma. And I mean, you could go on to discussion on discussion on discussion of this, right? It really does go far and wide.
And so now that we have a little bit of a better understanding of what trauma might look like and how in what ways it is presenting in our bodies, we can kind of consider a couple of things. So there's this study called the ACEs study that has really been a leader in trying to shift the way that we look at trauma. And if you want to learn more about this study, I would strongly recommend this TED Talk. It's called How Childhood Affects Health Across a Lifetime. And it's this woman, Nadine Burke Harris, who has taken a look at how trauma can really impact our overall well-being. And she summarizes the ACEs study so beautifully. It's a very short TED Talk. I really recommend it. It's like 15 minutes long. We'll link that in our show notes for you to check out if that's something you're interested in. And by the way, if you hear my little one, he's in the background having some fun and playing some games. So just know that that's just my kiddo in the background.
Yeah. Hashtag mom life.
Yeah. So the CDC Kaiser A study is one of the largest investigations of childhood abuse and neglect.
ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. A, adverse, C, childhood, E, experiences. The study looked at multiple categories, so including abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, systemic racism, living in a high crime neighborhood, things that could have long-term health effects from trauma experienced in childhood.
I'll read what it says. The CDC Kaiser Permanente Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is one of the largest investigations of childhood abuse and neglect and household challenges and later health and well-being. The original ACE study was conducted at Kaiser Permanente from 1995 to 1997 with 2 waves of data collection. Over 17,000 health maintenance organization members from Southern California receiving physical exams completed confidential surveys regarding their childhood experiences and current health status and behaviors. And so essentially what this study is able to pick up is how our health has been impacted and how much of a higher risk we are of continuing to experience trauma later in life based on what we've experienced in childhood.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because there can be long-lasting responses that would then translate to chronic health conditions, or could even then result in behavior that would be risky to someone's health, potentially repeating these cycles of abuse in a household. So it can, again, just be generational, due to family dynamics, to systems, to even a one-time kind of occurrence that then, depending on the person, can then escalate into chronic health conditions or such behaviors that would then continue to risk a person's health. With all of that, I feel like we need to take a collective breath or a sigh, right? Because it is a lot. And even in just talking about this, Joe and I, it's like we've had to take a couple breaks. So I do want to acknowledge that can be happening for you even listening to this. So please do pause or, come back to this if it does feel like quite a bit, because that is 100% understandable. So I would like to change the mood just a little bit.
Yes.
And having heard all of this, right? We've talked about what is trauma, how do we experience it, where can it come from? Does this mean it's over for you, right? If you've experienced a trauma in your childhood or in your adulthood, does that mean it's an uphill battle forever and ever? No, you're not a doomed person. Not at all. This is something that you can heal from, and it's all going to be very personal in how that healing process plays out. And certainly some of us are more predisposed than others to be impacted by trauma in a certain way. So again, if you are experiencing trauma, to try not to make comparisons, because someone else, again, going into that like my suffering versus your suffering, because someone else is genetically made up different, and they may seemingly from the outside seem to have handled like just fine and gotten over it, but there may be other things playing into that, and some of that may be genetic predisposition. So please, if it feels like it is a long journey, there is healing available for you.
Yeah, and one of the things that I wanted to make sure to share today is something called protective factors. I don't think we've covered that yet, but it's shown that there are certain pieces or variables that can make us more resilient to trauma. And those can be things like, is there somebody that I can talk to? Is there someone that I know that understands me? And, having a supportive network. If there's at least one individual in your life that you feel you can talk to, that will make the difference.
Yeah, community resources. So if you're someone who is spiritual or religious and you have a church community, that can be one. It could be support groups. So if you're feeling like you're really pulling or really reaching to try and find a friend or, that kind of connection, that it can come from a different group of people. And sometimes talking to strangers can even be easier. So if that's in a support group, and you're surrounded by people with similar experiences and you feel a little bit more freed to then release what has been putting a lot of weight on your heart, community, definitely. Sometimes even in the form of coworkers, people that you see all the time, whether that be now virtually, even because of pandemic. Some other protective factors would be like self-care, going to your self-care toolkit, or going and moving your body, listening to music. So all of those things can be part of your protective factors. But certainly relationship seems to be a big one.
Parental resilience too. If you have one caregiver that, and it may not necessarily be a direct parent, it could be a family member that has been there for you and been supportive to your journey. Social connections.
Like for students, that can be a social worker or a therapist or a teacher that is on their campus. That's huge. Having a safe place to go to, either physically or safe people who can then give you that support and can kind of in a way transfer a bit of their own resilience onto you and model that for you, and also be able to hold space for you.
Break time. This is heavy stuff, everyone. Like, take it easy. I'm feeling really lightheaded, actually. That tends to be my response. Like, oh, okay, slow down.
And it brings to mind something called, you probably heard about it, Joe, compassion fatigue. That can happen a lot to social workers, people who care for other people who are in service-oriented professions, and having to always play that role of compassionate person who holds space, having to take and absorb so much emotion can really cause a lot of fatigue, which is why we do have a lot of burnout in service-oriented, healthcare workers and people who take care of other people, because it's hard.
Thank you if you're out there providing this work for others.
This
is, amazing work, tough work.
Tough work, and you do not go unrecognized. Definitely not for me. Thank you for you, and take care of yourself. So how about if you want to look into this a little bit more? We did mention a book, and so if you're like, whoa, this is a lot, I want to nerd out on this stuff for myself and for other people, but I want something that I can take my time with. Books are great for that. So we mentioned The Body Keeps the Score, which we'll link, and the Kaiser study as well, if you want to look into that. TED Talks are amazing.
Yes.
And a different one, which isn't quite trauma related, but it's related to our body, is a book that I just started, and it's called The Body, actually. The Body, A Guide for Occupants. It's all about the anatomy of the body, but it's not like a science book.
It makes me think, this is my vessel.
This book, it's more about your inner workings, and it is so humbling to read. So it is not a like, here are the pieces of our body in the name of muscles, and this goes in and that goes out and this moves here. It's not like that, right? It reads like a true novel, like a story, because it is full of history and scientific stories and stories about discovery. So if you want a little bit more of an overview and kind of into our wonder about our bodies and how much they really do for us, this might be a great way to start. And then The Body Keeps the Score is a book that I actually, confession, haven't even finished because it is so intense. Like, if it takes you a year to read this book, it's okay.
I'm such a nerd. I read this a second time.
Oh my goodness. So if you're like Joe, you might devour it. But
really
if you're
it really dives into the neuroscience, and I geek out on that. So
yeah. So just, it's okay if it takes you a while. Like, I still have not finished it. And also because it can be triggering. So I had to stop a couple times and recognize, all right, this is a little bit much for me right now. Little disclaimer on that one. But yeah, there are lots of resources, and certainly we're talking about this because we felt like it was relevant to our time right now and in talking about healing in general. But this by no means means you've got to do this work now, right? This is more of like a discussion and somewhere to then go from if it is something that you want to go explore a little more.
Mm-hmm. So we've covered quite a bit today. And this has been a process. And if you're listening still and you've listened this far, thank you. We are here with you. We are here to support your journey in whatever shape or form works for you. So let's take a look at what we talked about today. We talked about trauma. We defined trauma. And we also talked a little bit about how do we know if we're needing support right now? At what point is it that we really need to seek out help? And also how trauma can be universal. We've all had some kind of trauma in our lives, and it's important to take a look at it when we feel safe enough to heal and do some of that work so that we can move forward.
And we've also shared a few resources, so that being books, studies, and a little bit on, if you want to go and do your own research, when you're doing your research, that you're going to trusted resources, because we know what it's like to go and start Googling your symptoms, right? When you're like, oh, I have this itch, and then you start Googling things and you're like, oh my God, now, and you go down that rabbit hole. And I want for you all to be able to safely research as you're looking into this a little bit further. Also, to then look into where your sources are coming from. So who are the people behind it? And so if you're a person of color, if this is a study you're looking at, are there people of color that are being considered in this study? Is the person who's driving the study or on the team, or do they have people of color? This could be, I'm just using that as an example, but take a look at yourself and what would be important for you to see reflected in the information, because that's also important to know and consider where or who's driving this resource. And finally, before we do go into our closing, a little side note. This has been, I would say, a little bit more different than our normal kind of an episode. This is, for us, we've mentioned that this has been a lot of work, and even so, we've had to take our break. So if we sound a little disjointed in any way, it's because this is tough stuff. Yeah. And we've had to stop a couple times and take in a deep breath and reorient ourselves. I'm also extending myself a little bit of compassion, and also to you, Joe, and that this has been tough, but we do this again with so much love and just knowing that there are people out there who are going through things, and we would never want anyone to feel like they are alone ever in their suffering. So Joe wrote a song, and we're going to close with that. Which I think will be a beautiful touch for this, and another way to end on a much lighter and happier, hopefully, note.
Yes. So I'm really excited to share this. It has been such a pleasure to be able to use art as a form to express what this process has been like, this healing journey. And I've had some help from Denise and had some help from the group FTIS. They actually wrote the intro music and outro music for us, which is what we are going to use for this song. At some point we'll record it and stuff, but for now I will read it to you. And it goes a little something like this. I am love. I am me. I am my own identity. I feel, I exist. I am worthy and more than enough. I want to be me. I want to be free. I honor this mind, body, and spirit. I accept me as I am. I accept what I am becoming. I am awakening. I am enlightened. I am becoming. I am evolved. So there it is. Thank you so much for listening to us today and for going on this journey with us.
Thank you so much. With all our love.
Mwah.
Mwah. We thank you for sharing your time with us and for listening to the Love and Evolve podcast, where we share tools, resources, and education on topics that cover holistic wellness, encompassing mind, body, and spirit.
Find details on how to stay connected with us in the show notes. We'd love to hear from you. Les damos un fuerte y enorme abrazo. Mwah.
Mwah.